Perfect. So I'm going to get started. So at the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth, we recently conducted the impact evaluation of this program, so the Growth Vouchers Program. And we think that in addition of presenting and discussing some of the findings, there are a couple of key lessons for both design of similar schemes, but also for other impact evaluations. And that's roughly the idea of what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to start by, explaining the program. Then I'm going to touch base a little bit on data sources and some of the challenges that we saw with the program when it was being implemented. I think it's important to mention that this was implemented not by us, but by government. And so that in that sense, we're only, extrapolating some of the lessons from that time. And then I'm going to touch base on, what we're seeing as some of the effects of the program. And then we're going to test the methodology we're using here with another methodology that is commonly used for evaluation of policy interventions. So the Growth Vouchers Program, it was implemented in 2014, 2015. It was designed and run by the then Department for Industrial Strategy, Business and Industrial Strategy, and the Behavioral Insights team. The aim was basically to encourage businesses and to help them to grow. And the rationale is that some of these businesses, they may have some financial constraints. And so, they potentially couldn't afford to pay for business advice. But also that in some instances, there are a lot of providers and it's really a little bit unclear which is the quality of the provider and where to go to, find like good advice. And so businesses were eligible if they had been operating for at least a year, they had less than 50 employees, and they hadn't, in theory, paid for advice over the previous years. This was a big program, so around 28,000 businesses applied to the scheme, and it was implemented as a randomized controlled trial. So what do we mean by this? I'm going to explain this in detail in the next couple of slides, but basically that some businesses were randomly selected to receive support, while others were randomly selected to, go into the control group. That means that they didn't get any supports. And this was completely randomly selected. And so that's how this program was set up. And so just explain a little bit around the journey that businesses face from application to the end of the program. They had 4 different steps. So first, those who were eligible applied to the program. Then in the second stage, everyone got some sort of diagnostic support. So this was also randomly allocated. So we had a ratio of 75% of businesses which were sent to a personal diagnostic. By personal diagnostic, we mean that this was either face-to-face or over the phone, or this was 2014-15, so through Skype, not Zoom or any of these new platforms. And so it was 25 of businesses were sent to an simple online questionnaire. And this was basically just to respond a couple of questions online about, the performance and the concerns of the business. It's good in the sense that it also allows to support the impact evaluation, but the key aspect is what's coming next. So once that business is completing the application, they were referred to a type of diagnostic. They either completed the online questionnaire or arrange a meeting with an advisor. Then they had to select a theme of advice. And so the program had 5 themes of advice. So these were sales and marketing, raising finance, leadership and management, workforce development, and digital technologies. And then once they had selected the theme of advice, some businesses were randomly given a voucher to cover for around £2,000, which they could use to pay for business advice. So within each theme of advice, we see that businesses were randomly allocated to either the treatment group or the control group. This was also done by a 75 to 25% ratio. And in many cases, this is done by 50-50%. Here, the aim was to basically try to reach to a larger number of businesses, to support, a larger number of businesses. And so 75% of businesses within each theme of advice receive a voucher, which they can then use to purchase business advice. I think it's also important to mention that every single business, regardless of whether they receive the voucher or not, they were referred to a list of business advice providers. So everyone was basically directed to this online portal where you can just basically skim through and identify a provider depending on your needs and your budget. And you could also pay for that advice even if you didn't receive the voucher. I think it's also important maybe to mention that the distribution of businesses between these themes of advice. So nearly 50% of the businesses selected sales and marketing, only 13% raising finance, leadership and management, and digital technologies between 15 and 20%, and only a minority of businesses went for workforce development. So everyone received that diagnostic support, which was either online or personal diagnostic, and the vouchers were allocated to some businesses randomly. What we see is that around, so the mean value of the voucher was around £1,700. So businesses had to cover for the other 50% of the advice. So the total purchase of advice was around just below £4,000. And when businesses were, purchasing this business advice, it was basically engaging consultants to provide strategic and bespoke advice. And this was assistance over the course of weeks or months. And the intensity, of course, vary, and the type of support vary depending on the business and the needs of each firm. But basically, we think that this was around providing, developing a marketing strategy or exploring financing alternatives. So that type of relationship is what happened after they purchased business advice. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor of, what type of businesses we're seeing or apply to the program. So the average business that went into GVP had already been in business for around 9 years. They had a turnover of around £800,000 per year, around 7 employees, and some of them were exporting, but just roughly less than 25%. And it's also maybe important to say that they were from every region and every single sector in the UK. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we use and some of the implementational challenges for the program, but that also has some implications for the impact evaluation that we conducted. The first, we have some primary data. So that's basically information that was collected directly from businesses at baseline. So that means when businesses were applying to the program, they had to fill a long form, which included a lot of questions, a lot of information, which was useful for a couple of different points, which I'm going to touch on. And then the program also intended to interview businesses after a year, roughly, and after 2 years from engaging with the program. Now, what type of information was collected? So businesses were asked just roughly, for example, on firm performance. So if their turnover had increased, decreased, stayed the same. So just self-reporting, what was happening within the business. But they also score and range some capabilities and practices. And so just to give you a couple of examples of practices, or basically, it was just a simple yes or no. Are you doing this? Yes or no? Do you have a marketing budget? Yes or no? Do you, do you have a marketing plan? Yes or no? And then capabilities, it was a score between 1 and 5. And it was mostly around, how good do you think you are for developing new products and for accessing UK markets and for, doing X, Y, or Z. Now, the issue with this data is that, it requires a lot of time, resources for interviewing businesses many years after they apply for the program. And in this case, it implies interviewing businesses who went into the control group. So they basically didn't get a voucher. They did apply for the program. They did get some diagnostic support, but they didn't get a voucher. And so, of course, the number of businesses that respond to this survey over time decreases dramatically. And so that is one kind of a shortcoming with this data. The other shortcoming is that everything is self-reported. Changing turnover is just, increase or decrease or stay the same, but it's not a precise number that we could use for the impact evaluation, for example. And so the other data set we use for this is the Interdepartmental Business Register. This is from BASE. It's the most comprehensive source of data for businesses in the UK. It covers, I think, around 99% of businesses in the UK. And in this data set, what we have is annual data on employees, turnover, and of course, the main aspect is that this requires identifying a business that went into the program in these data sets. And just going to mention a couple of things around that, which is that it's useful to collect at baseline a few identifiers that allow us to do that. So for example, a company's house number for businesses in the form when they're applying to the program. And this is what actually was done, getting some of these identifiers to eventually be able to follow businesses in time, which doesn't require to interview them. It doesn't require, for example, setting up a questionnaire and conducting the interviews, which is time consuming and expensive, and we don't get like a good response rate in most cases. Now, the issue is that, of course, we're not able to identify a business because, the numbers they provided don't match with some other issues. So we are only able to follow 67% of businesses. And these, of course, have a couple of other caveats. It requires some planning around collecting the data, getting the matching, getting access to the data. And then we have a lag for a couple of outcomes in this data set. So if we were to access this data set today, for employment, we will only have data from 2023, and for turnover from 2022. So it's a 2-year lag. And that's just useful in the element to keep in mind, in the sense that if we're doing an impact evaluation today, we would only be able to measure impacts for 2022 when it comes to turnover. And then a couple of implementational challenges and issues that we see, with lessons also for program design. First, the programs struggle a little bit with engaging businesses, even though there was the potential for getting a voucher worth of up to £1,000. A lot of businesses didn't apply to the program initially. And so then there was a really big marketing campaign during the final months of the program. And that meant that around 1/3 of the businesses that went into the program applied in the last month. So that was a bit tricky. I mean, it was the marketing campaign apparently was useful because a lot of businesses ended up applying, but it was tricky because in the second stage, after applying, when businesses were getting diagnostic support, in theory, 75% of them were meant to be receiving a personal diagnostic. But that, of course, couldn't happen because this exceeded the capacity of the delivery partners. And so a lot of the businesses were then sent to the online diagnostic. It's fine from an implementational perspective. It's kind of like a lesson that, if capacity is exceeded, what do we do? And then in terms of the lesson for the impact evaluation, it's then not necessarily straightforward to compare those who went into the online track versus the personal track. However, this is, from a technical perspective, is relatively simple, to fix. And in addition, if we wanted, we could also exclude the last month of applicants, and then just do the impact evaluation, excluding the businesses that came through the door in the last month. Then we also see that there are a lot of businesses, so around 8,000, that didn't complete the application process. So they didn't complete the diagnostic, let alone selected a theme of advice. And what we see is that a lot of these businesses are dropping out from the personal track versus the online track. Here are just a couple of reflections on our thinking. And this is that basically setting up a call with an advisor or setting up a meeting with an advisor was maybe a bit more time consuming, and it really required a different commitment versus just filling out like an online form and getting like a quick response after 15 minutes. And so at this stage, it seems that just having an online type of tool that provides a diagnostic for businesses could be cost effective and could encourage businesses to keep going through the journey. However, and this is another implementational challenge that we see, is that there was a relatively low voucher take-up. That means that only a third of the businesses that completed the process got a voucher. Only a third of those ones actually used the voucher. So a lot of businesses had a voucher worth for up to £2,000, but they never used it. This is relatively in line with the evidence. But then going back to the point of personal diagnostic versus online diagnostic, what we see is that it's the opposite. So those who went through the personal diagnostic track, they end up having a much higher take-up. And this is potentially just a reflection that once you're committed to having a meeting, committed to applying for the program, committed to what it requires making some adjustments within the business, then you actually use the voucher. You're more likely to use the voucher relative to someone who just filled out the form and selected a theme of advice. So the personal aspect here kind of like increases the take-up of voucher, which is also nice. So it's a little bit unclear, or there are some relevant differences between personal and online track when it comes to this. And the second point on the low voucher take-up is that this also presents a challenge for the impact evaluation, because we shouldn't necessarily compare directly treated versus controlled businesses, because we have a bunch of them, 2/3 of them, who are not using their voucher. And so, but again, this is also something that from like a technical perspective is relatively easy to solve. And that's what we have done here. Now I'm going to move on to the results of the impact evaluation. So the headline message is that we see that businesses increase their turnover a year after being involved into the program, and this is by around 82 percentage points. Here we are comparing those businesses that receive and use the voucher versus the rest. And if we try to basically break it down by which businesses are driving this this increase in turnover, we don't see any difference depending on the size of the business or the age of the business. And then I'm going to go into the details of these, but just broadly what we see is that what businesses are telling us in the survey, so in terms of their capabilities and practices, are relatively in line with what we're seeing, which is an increase in turnover after a year. And so our results are relatively consistent with other evaluations of business advice or business support. And what we see is that there are some positive effects for some outcomes, not for others. In general, these programs are better at increasing turnover than employment. And we also see that these effects tend to be temporarily. And as I mentioned, there are some improvements in some capabilities and practices, but doesn't necessarily translate into sustained improving performance. Now, how do we, came up with this set of findings? So first, what we did was basically to look into the IDVR. So secondary data. This is, precise data on turnover and employment, and we did this for 2 years. So a year after the program ended, and then 2 years after the program ended. And as I said, we do see a positive increase on turnover, but only after a year, and we don't see any effect on employment in the first or the second year. And then we compare these against the survey data. And so for the first year, what we see is that, businesses are also telling us that their turnover had increased. And so this is a nice storyline. It matches with what we have, but this is of course self-reported, and it's only if it increase or decrease or stay the same. But it's a relatively coherent, consistent storyline. And then in terms of what's potentially driving the increase in turnover, so we see that businesses are reporting that they improve their capability for developing new products. And they do this after 1 year, but also after second year. So that improvement is still there after 2 years. And then in terms of practices, each theme of advice had a set of specific theme of advice, a set of practices. And so those practices were improving. Basically, businesses are doing changes in line with the advice that they are receiving. But also, there are some improvements in terms of having a marketing plan after a year, and then having a marketing budget after 2 years. So this is relatively consistent, since that developing new products is what's driving the increase in turnover. What it's a little bit striking is that that improvement in capabilities and in the adoption of some practices remains, but we don't see that the effects on increased turnover remains after 2 years. That's a little bit of a puzzle. And so, we have a couple of hypotheses on why that could be the case. One of them is that businesses improve their capability for developing new products, but that doesn't necessarily translate in access to markets. And so, they have like a short-term push for increasing turnover, but that doesn't sustain because they don't access other markets. It could also be that their competitors react, and there could be also other storylines going on around that. If we were to focus on those businesses that receive business advice on marketing and sales and marketing, we do see that the effects persist to at least 24 months to 2 years, because for those ones, we do have a positive effect on turnover in the first year, but also in the second year. What is a bit unfortunate is that we don't have specific details of the advice and the relationship between businesses and advisors. So we don't know, for example, how many meetings took place. We don't know, if the outcome of that service was to, apply for funding or to do X, Y, or Z. And so we don't know if that advice was poor, if the advice was insufficient, or it was ultimately not implemented by businesses. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about something which is slightly different to what we have been discussing, but that is really useful for other impact evaluations. And so what we also did, in addition to getting some results for the program, was to use the IDVR data to assess other methodologies for conducting this impact evaluation. And the reason is that we had the IDVR dataset, which was basically the whole universe of businesses in the UK. And we took that as an opportunity to test this other methodology. And so the key aspect of most impact evaluations is just to have a good, credible control group. And in this case, that was done by randomizing, which is like the gold standard. And that really gives us a comparable treated and control group. So these are like-for-like groups, which allows us to compare them and to get a measure for the effect of the program. Now, the problem with other impact evaluation methodologies is that there are always some issues with the quality of the control group. And so one of those methodologies, which is commonly used in policy evaluations, is propensity score matching, which basically what it tries to do is to get some units, in this case businesses, which are relatively comparable, and use them as a control group. As this is, of course, done based on the information available. And because we have every single business in the UK, we were basically able to match from like a really large pool of businesses. And so we were in that position to basically test this methodology. And so what we do is we get another set of results using propensity score matching. So we see which businesses receive and use the voucher, and then we basically identify a control group by doing this matching technique. And then we compare the result from the ones that I just showed you with the results that we got through propensity score matching. And then we see, how different would have been the results had this program not been implemented as a randomized control trial. And so this is what we get. Each row corresponds to an outcome, and after a certain period, so turnover after a year, 2 years, employment 1 to 3 years. And the first column corresponds to the results that I showed in the previous slides. So for turnover after a year, this is the 8.2 percentage points that we find. And then the second column is what we get under the propensity score matching approach. And it's quite striking, the difference. So propensity score matching says that, there are effects which are positive for every outcome and in every period. And what is worse is that this bias increases over time. So for example, for turnover, it's 6% after a year, but then it's almost 13% after 2 years. And it's the same for employment. It goes from 3% positive to 8, then to 10. And so what we conclude from these exercises is that, despite having high quality IDVR data, which basically results in a really good matching approach, and this is because we have the whole universe of businesses in the UK, or the conclusions and the results are completely different. So had this program, GVP, not been implemented as a randomized control trial, the conclusion would have been completely different. We would have put a lot of money and resources to scale this program and try to reach out as many businesses as possible, because those findings from TSM, they're just basically completely misleading. And just a quick reflection on why we think that might be the case. Matching in other contexts. So when we're with the unit of analysis is an individual or a household, in those cases, we usually have a rich set of information. So, we have the sex of the household head, the age of the household head, the household composition, education, location, income, so on, so on, so on. And so it's a bit easier, we think, to model the behavior of of individuals or households, because we usually have more information. For businesses, it's a little bit of a black box, because we do see, for example, employment. And let's say that we are doing a good matching and we have a business who receive a voucher and has 6 employees. And then that business is matched with another business from the same sector, from the same region, that also has 6 employees. But we don't know if these 6 employees are new. We don't know if these 6 employees are in an entry-level position or if they're in a senior position. We don't know if, the turnover of these 6 employees, it's frequent, and that's potentially likely to affect, the performance of the business. And so because we don't have those, no one really has that, the depth of characteristics on businesses, it's pretty unlikely that propensity score matching will give us a pretty good control group. And so some of the conclusions, we're now able to say something around the impact of this program, of the Growth Vouchers Program, because a robust impact evaluation was considered, and in this case, specifically, it was considered as a randomized control trial. Of course, the planning of both the program and the evaluation took quite some time, so a couple of years, and it required also planning a couple of steps. So getting access to some data, getting identified from businesses, planning to conduct interview for businesses. And as I said, we were missing a little bit of M&E data on the specifics of the advice received. That would potentially help us in understand a little bit better, what we're seeing on terms of the impact on firm performance. And what we see is that the program increased turnover, but only after a year. The effect is relatively large. So 82 percentage points is relatively, good, but we don't know the cost for the business. So businesses potentially had to readjust, some processes, or, to spend some additional funding to, achieve some targets, and that we don't know. So it's a little bit unclear whether, on the cost benefit side of things, if that makes sense or not. And one concern that we do have is that most businesses that receive and use a voucher, around 70% of them are in non-tradable or medium tradable sectors, which basically means they're likely to only serve a local market or a national market. And so by improving the turnover of a couple of businesses, it could be that, that increase comes at the expense of other businesses that didn't apply to the program. And so that would be a concern, because ultimately we're kind of like picking a winner instead of, improving the overall growth of the economy. And so that's a concern with this, one of these findings that we have. And then, the last conclusion is that using propensity score matching, basically, it would have, led us to conclude something completely different. And so we think that ideally introducing randomized controlled trials whenever we're thinking about supporting businesses might be quite useful from an evaluation perspective to help us improve the evidence base in this space. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So if lots there. If you want to know more about the evidence behind business advice, you can find our evidence reviews on our website. Also, you'll see our core concepts on economic growth, which cover, we have one on tradable versus non-tradable, and we also have one on displacement. So Gonzalo's final points just there, that if you're thinking, okay, actually that's something I want to know a bit more about, that's a good place to start, is understanding core concepts in economic growth. And if this has whet your appetite for impact evaluation, we also have training, an introduction to impact evaluation. Our next date is full, but do check out, new dates are usually shared on our newsletter. So we've had a couple questions in the chat, but please do add some more. And we're going to move over to our Q&A section. So I'd like to ask